Hi, I'm Anna Rose Johnson, the author of The Star That Always Stays, which releases from Holiday House on July 12th. It's a historical middle grade novel, and I am excited to read the prologue for you today. So here goes. Beaver Island, November 1910. Mukadewezi, Black. Pa promised he wouldn't sail in shipwreck season anymore. The wind swallowed up Norvia Nelson's words, and she wasn't even sure if her older brothers had heard her. Only one question had circled the house for days. When would Pa come home? Norvia ran from the little porch toward the shoreline of Lake Michigan, hoping to see any evidence of the stalwart schooner Rouse Simmons manifesting on the dusky horizon. The sky rumbled overhead, glowering with thunder, and the island's harbor, a collection of wooden docks and flickering lights, was battered by waves below. "Nothing yet," said Norvia, returning to the porch where her brothers were waiting. "He shouldn't have gone on this trip." Elton leaned against the doorway, gazing out at the shifting, gloomy waters. "I say the more he wants to go away, the better," said Herman, but he glanced nervously at the tossing waves, too. Elton folded his arms. "I just don't understand why he'd break a promise like that. He told Ma he wouldn't go out on a late run ever again." "He promised a lot of things," Herman shot back. "And he's kept most of his promises," said Norvia, turning away from them. All she wanted was for her father to come home. Then everything could be normal. He would stride in, smiling, she hoped, and Ma would be so relieved to have him safely back that she wouldn't be angry anymore. Perhaps Pa would even bring them gifts from the mainland, a necklace for her, something special for Ma, and they'd all laugh and sit around the hearth watching the flames of the fire unravel and snap and sparkle. "Let's go in," said Herman. He was right. The wind was cold and the waterline empty. Norvia lingered just a few minutes more, then followed the boys inside. Caspar, the youngest of her three brothers, stood by the front window, pressing his face against the rain-spattered glass. "Suppose they've been wrecked off one of the Fox Islands. Suppose they have to send a search crew after them." "Don't say that," said Norvia. "Aw, Norv," said Caspar, "it'd be exciting." She looked through the pane, too, straining her eyes, willing Pa to sail home to them. "The waters around Beaver Island are kind to their sons," said Grandpère, who had come to look out the window with them. "He'll come home all right." Grandpère is right, Norvia told herself, but uncertainty coiled around her heart. The house was quiet without her father. Ma was in the kitchen, and the Marys, the children's beloved grandmother and great-grandmother, were helping her. Like Grandpère, the Marys had always lived in the cozy white cottage with them, and they were revered in the family. They were both French Indian ladies, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, and motherly. Pa was the first one to call them the Marys, and while the Marys pretended they didn't like being addressed that way, the children could tell they did. Waves crashing in the gathering storm disturbed the silence of the house. Dicta, Norvia's younger sister, let out a little cry. She hated storms, even when Grandpère tried to tell her it was the sound of the thunderbird. "Perhaps if we start talking she'll be distracted from the noise," Norvia thought. She sat down by the hearth beside Grandpère, who had claimed his favorite rocking chair. "Tell me about your great-grandmother," said Norvia, warming her hands before the fire. "The one who looked like me." She'd heard these tales before, but each time they painted lush, elaborate scenes of bygone days in her mind. And now they would keep Dicta's mind, and her own, off the storm. Grandpère smiled at the faces of his daughter's listening children. The boys had joined them around the fire, and Dicta weaseled her way into Grandpère's lap. She was the only one small enough to still accomplish this feat. "My great-grandmother," he began, a remembering look on his face, "was born by the Red River over 100 years ago. Somewhere in Minnesota or Canada, I believe." His eyes shone from the glow of the firelight. He gestured with his hands, the hands that had once been blackened with frostbite. That was another story he had told them. He and his brother fell through broken ice into Lake Michigan one winter while transporting the mail to Beaver Island. Both Grandpère and Uncle Olivier had lived to tell the tale, even though everyone had given them up for lost. Will they give the Rouse Simmons up for lost? Norvia wondered, the thought chilling her all over again. But Grandpère's voice penetrated her thoughts, soothing her immediately. "Her name was Migizzi, which means bald eagle in Anishinaabewoan. Aren't those birds magnificent?" Norvia nodded eagerly. "They're so big and beautiful. "The ship's back! I've spotted it!" Casper yelled, his face bright with excitement. "The Rouse Simmons is gonna dock and we can see Pa!" Although she wanted to keep listening to Grandpère, Norvia scrambled up from the floor. As she ran to put on her hat and coat and dart out the door, she thought of how her grandparents had always provided such comfort for them, teaching them the ways of the past and the tales of their forefathers, dishing up food whenever Pa's gambling habits had left them penniless, giving them a sense of stability whenever seas grew rough. But she could not wait to rush into her father's arms. Reunions with him were always sweet, and she'd had this one planned ever since he sailed off to deliver Tanbark to Milwaukee. She would tell him all the little tidbits of news from his absence, like the Macaulay's new baby and the Republican rally. She would pass along an amusing joke that would make him laugh, and, most important, she would somehow make sure that he and Ma were happy together. Norvia and her siblings waited at the bottom of the path leading to the house, watching the harbor and the docking ship for what felt like hours. Despite her patched sails and peeling paint, the aged Rouse Simmons was still a beauty of a vessel. At last Pa came walking up the hill, tired but triumphant. Norvia ran to him and hugged him, delighting in all his familiarity, in that same old scent of tobacco. He kissed the top of her head and murmured, "Min daughter, have I not missed you?" Then he swung Dick onto his shoulders, tousled Casper's hair, and clapped Herman and Elton's backs. "You all look well and good," he said. "Papa, I learned to write my full name," Dick squealed. "My smart little girl." "Pa, what took you so long?" asked Casper breathlessly. "Storm slowed us down," said Pa, dismissing the subject. "Too many winds from the Manitou Islands. Where's your mother?" "Inside," said Herman flatly. His tone added, "Not out here waiting, that's for sure." They walked back to the house with a strange, slow expectancy. Norvia suddenly felt wobbly, as if she had been the one aboard a ship instead of her father. Grandpère opened the door for them. "Well, and how did it go?" he asked, smiling at the sight of his son-in-law. "It went as well as one might expect," replied Pa. Ma joined them in the entryway, dark eyes flashing with both relief and anguish, and Norvia understood that Pa's return would not be enough to overcome the torment he had put his wife through once again. "Come say hello to Pa," said Norvia, reaching out to take her mother's hand. "The ship made it through the storms." "I'm glad," said Ma tersely, wiping away a tear. "Anders, I need to speak with you." Norvia made one last desperate effort. She hated to do it. She hated making herself the center of attention, but it was necessary. She sprang toward the fireplace and pulled up 2 empty chairs alongside Grandpère's rocker. "Come sit down, Pa. There's so much I want to tell you. You can listen too, Ma." Pa glanced at her, sighed a little, and then gave Norvia a pat as he followed Ma into the kitchen. Norvia stood still, listening. It seemed no one dared to breathe. Then the conversation began, and Norvia could hear the tension in their voices as if they were already nearing an explosion. "We discussed this, Angie. I had to sail with them," Pa was insisting. "It paid good money that I couldn't afford to pass up." "You saw what terrible weather was brewing," said Ma. "You could have waited in Milwaukee." "Then I wouldn't have been paid at all," Pa shot back. Norvia turned back to look at Grandpère. He had returned to his rocking chair, and now young Mary and old Mary joined him by the fire. She wanted their voices to drown out the argument in the kitchen. "Grandpère, keep telling us about Migazy, please," she said anxiously. Young Mary smiled at Grandpère. "Didn't you say her hair was supposed to be the thickest and most beautiful in the family?" "That was the story my mother told me," Grandpère agreed. "I would say her hair was probably a good deal like Norvia's." Norvia felt herself smile. This was her favorite piece of the family lore, and the reason why she often wore her hair long and loose. Ma's broken sobs interrupted. "It's as if you don't care about us." Grandpère's voice resumed, even more rhythmic and comforting than before. Sometimes Migazy was called Isabelle, which was her French name. Norvia sat beside him and hugged her knees. The other children joined them. She knew all the stars by heart. She could name them all, knew all the great collections of stars. Migazy would look up into the night sky and point out all the animals that comprised the constellations, the fisher and the panther and the loon. "Do you remember which one is the Mong, the loon?" Norvia did remember. She thought of the many times she had gone for walks after dark with Grandpère and her brothers, when the world felt immense and distant, and the heavens raised a lofty roof of sparkles. "Yes," said Norvia, envisioning the loon's shape in the night sky. "I remember." Mickezy's mother was a highly respected woman in the reindeer clan, said Grandpere. As the story goes, one of Mickezy's grandparents was a Dakota. In those days, the Ojibwe and Dakota tribes did not always get along. Yes, this was much more relaxing. This felt normal, even if she felt guilty for enjoying these tales that her father often scorned. A warm strength always grew inside her as she listened to the tales of her dark-haired ancestors. There are those who do not think much of Migizi because of the Dakota in her blood, Grandpere admitted, reaching out to stroke their cat who lay asleep on the wood floor. Other people, children especially, can be so cruel. But she would only smile when she heard their taunts because she knew they would come to respect her, as long as she held her head up high. And she was your mother's grandmother, offered Norvia, who loved hearing about the exact lineage. Yes, my mother was Elizabeth, Lizette, of course, but in Anishinaabe, her real name meant she gathers stories, Grandpere recounted. Her mother was Genevieve, and Migizi was Genevieve's mother. Pa's voice cracked through the house, so loud that the kitchen couldn't possibly contain it. Do you want me to just give up? Give up trying to give us a better life? You aren't trying to do that, Ma screamed. You're just trying to get back to the way you used to live. But now it was almost as if none of them could even hear the wild conversation bursting from the next room. There was only the story. Migizi's brother, or half-brother, was one of the best interpreters in the country, continued Grandpere. He knew Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe language, along with English and French and Cree and many other languages. Ma's voice sounded even shriller this time. There's nothing you can do to change it. If Migizi wasn't part French like her daughters, then why was she called Isabel sometimes and Migizi at other times? Norvia asked, in an effort to prolong this conversation. Her grandfather paused a moment, considering. Migizi was her true Ojibwe name. When she was a little girl, her mother remarried, and Migizi had a new French voyager for a stepfather. Somewhere along the way, she received a French name and was given her stepfather's surname. You mean he made her change her name? Norvia was shocked. Grandpere chuckled. Something like that, I suppose. Perhaps she was glad of the change. Who can say? But Norvia knew she would not like having her name changed by a perfect stranger. He didn't want her to be an Indian? She asked, suspecting the truth. I don't know, Cher. I think it was simply the way it was done in those days. The old days, echoed young Mary. Once again she smiled at Grandpere, a smile that made Norvia feel safe. Pa spoke again, louder than ever. I know you're right. You don't have to say it again. There's nothing I can do about it. I know I'll never be able to do anything to change my life. The kitchen door slammed open and Pa emerged, his face an alarming mixture of defeat and anger. He stared at Grandpere and Norvia. You're not filling my child's head with your old nonsense again, are you? Pa demanded. Just the stories of their family, of their heritage, said Grandpere simply. I don't think it's nonsense. Is it not bad enough that they have Indian blood, now they must learn all about it? Pa's voice shook, and then he stormed out the front door. Norvia trembled. Her mind kept replaying Pa's words over and over again. There's nothing I can do about it. Do you want me to just give up? Is it not bad enough that they have Indian blood? I don't want you to get into trouble, Cher, murmured Grandpere. I will stop my rambling. Over the next few years, Norvia would come to remember her grandfather's words, to hear them at scattered intervals during the tempests of her parents' lives. She would remember his tales of quarreling tribes and of the stepfather who changed Migizi's name. But mostly she remembered her father's face and the way it made her feel. So, that's the end of the prologue. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will buy The Star That Always Stays when it releases on July 12th.